the feeling of someone deliberately breaking into her door. It wasn't fear, but a cold fury that ran down her spine. She didn't knock, she didn't ask. She simply took out her keys, trying them one by one, as if she were opening her own warehouse. Her eyes flashed with triumph as the lock began to turn, but what she didn't see was the shadow moving behind the garage door, silently waiting. She thought she had the right, because she was the president, but today everything would change. No more silent suffering, no more bowing to that arrogance. I didn't lock the door out of fear, but because I wanted to see how far she would go, and this time, she herself had crossed the line that required a legal explanation. After my divorce 2 years ago, I moved to the quiet suburb of Maple Grove, hoping for some peace and a chance to rebuild my life. At 47, I was a freelance graphic designer at home, focusing on tending my garden and watching baseball on the weekends. My son, Jake, now 30, visited every few weeks, a quiet, calm man. I was David Morrison, a straight-talking guy who just wanted to enjoy life. But then came Karen Sullivan, our 38-year-old HOA president, elected 2 years ago to uphold community standards. She spoke in a way that made every conversation feel like a business meeting, with a sharp, piercing gaze that could cut through steel. Little did I know, Karen's idea of community standards was about to cause more trouble than I could have imagined. It all started innocently enough last month when I decided to plant some sunflowers in my front yard. They were beautiful specimens, standing about 5 feet tall and displaying brilliant yellow faces that turned to follow the sun throughout the day. I thought they added a cheerful touch to the neighborhood and figured they'd be a nice conversation starter with the neighbors. The morning after I finished planting them, I stood back admiring my work with a cup of coffee, feeling proud of the splash of color they brought to what had been a pretty, bland stretch of grass and shrubs. Boy, was I wrong about that being a good idea. The first attack came exactly 1 week after I planted those sunflowers, and it was like nothing I'd ever experienced in any neighborhood before. Karen showed up at my door at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, dressed in her usual white button-down and blue jeans, but this time she carried herself with the bearing of someone delivering a court summons. She had a printed citation in her hand, complete with an official-looking letterhead featuring the Maple Grove HOA logo and a fine amount that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. "Mr. Morrison," she said in that clipped, businesslike tone that made every word sound like it was being read from a legal document, "you're in violation of HOA Regulation 15-3 regarding plant height restrictions in front yard landscaping." I stood there in my doorway, still in my pajamas and completely blindsided by this formal accusation about flowers that I'd planted on my own property. I was genuinely confused because I'd read through our HOA guidelines pretty thoroughly when I moved in, and I didn't remember seeing anything specific about plant heights or landscaping restrictions beyond basic maintenance requirements. When I mentioned this to Karen, pointing out that I'd reviewed the covenants and restrictions document, she simply adjusted her notebook against her chest like a shield and replied in a voice that could freeze water. "Well, Mr. Morrison, as the duly elected president of this homeowner association, I have the authority to interpret our community guidelines and determine what's appropriate for maintaining our neighborhood's aesthetic standards and property values." The way she emphasized duly elected and authority made it clear that she considered this conversation over, but I wasn't about to back down from someone trying to fine me $150 for planting flowers in my own yard. "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice reasonable, "I'd like to see the specific regulation you're citing, because I don't believe it exists in our current bylaws." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment I saw something flash across her face that looked almost like anger at being questioned. "Mr. Morrison, I don't have time to educate every homeowner about every single rule and regulation. The fine stands, and you have 14 days to either pay it or remove the offending vegetation." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing in my doorway holding a citation for the crime of beautifying my own property. The second wave of harassment began the following week when Karen started what I can only describe as a systematic surveillance campaign. Every morning at exactly 8:30 and every evening at 6:15, she would appear on the sidewalk in front of my house, walking slowly and deliberately while taking notes in that ever-present notebook of hers. But this wasn't just casual observation, it was methodical documentation. She would stop directly in front of my sunflowers and pull out her smartphone, taking photographs from multiple angles like she was documenting evidence at a crime scene. I watched from my office window as she crouched down to take close-up shots of the base of each plant, then stepped back to capture the full height, and even took pictures from the street, looking toward my house to show the flowers in relation to the property line. Between photos, she would scribble furiously in her notebook, occasionally glancing up at my windows to see if I was watching. The whole performance was clearly designed to intimidate me, and I had to admit it was working. It's unnerving to have someone treating your home like it's under criminal investigation, especially when you haven't done anything wrong. My neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years and had seen multiple HOA presidents come and go, pulled me aside one afternoon while I was checking my mailbox. "David," she whispered, glancing around nervously like she was afraid Karen might be listening. "You need to be very careful with that woman. She did exactly the same thing to the Rodriguez family last year, taking pictures and writing citations, making their lives so miserable with constant harassment that they eventually gave up and moved away rather than continue fighting her." That conversation sent a chill down my spine because it meant Karen's behavior toward me wasn't personal or spontaneous. It was a calculated strategy she'd used successfully before to drive out homeowners who didn't comply with her vision of neighborhood conformity. The third escalation happened while I was out of town for 3 days on a business trip to meet with a potential client in another state. I left on Wednesday morning feeling confident that a few days away would give the situation time to cool down, and maybe Karen would find something else to focus her attention on while I was gone. When I returned home on Saturday evening, exhausted from traveling and looking forward to just relaxing in my garden, I found my mailbox completely plastered with violation notices. There wasn't just one citation, there were 7 different colored papers, each one detailing a separate infraction that had allegedly occurred during my brief absence. The citations were almost comically thorough in their pettiness. There was one for allowing weeds to exceed the 2-inch height limit in the front yard grass area, another for failure to remove fallen leaves within the prescribed 48-hour window, and my personal favorite, contributing to neighborhood decay through neglect of property maintenance standards during extended absence from residents. Reading through these citations, I realized that Karen had been monitoring my house daily while I was gone, probably timing exactly when leaves fell from the oak tree in my front yard and measuring the height of what she was calling weeds, but were actually just grass that had grown slightly longer than her arbitrary standard. She had clearly used my absence as an opportunity to manufacture as many violations as possible, probably hoping that the sheer volume of citations would overwhelm me into giving up. The fourth assault on my peace of mind came in the form of a very public humiliation at the monthly HOA meeting. I had attended these meetings sporadically since moving to the neighborhood, usually finding them boring discussions about landscaping budgets and holiday decoration schedules. But this time, Karen had apparently decided to make me the main event. She stood at the podium in the community center, wearing what looked like her most authoritative business outfit, and addressed the crowd of about 30 neighbors like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "I want to bring to everyone's attention a concerning pattern of violations that threatens our community standards," she began. And I had a sinking feeling in my stomach about where this was heading. "Mr. Morrison, who lives on Elm Street," she continued, consulting her notebook like she was reading from an official document, "has repeatedly refused to comply with our community guidelines despite multiple citations and opportunities to correct his violations." She then proceeded to read aloud a comprehensive list of my alleged infractions, making each one sound like a serious threat to neighborhood stability. According to Karen's presentation, my car had been parked 6 inches from the curb instead of the required 4 inches on multiple occasions. I had failed to properly maintain my hedge trimming schedule according to the seasonal maintenance calendar, and somehow I was responsible for the fact that a stray cat had been spotted multiple times crossing my yard, making me liable for contributing to what she called uncontrolled pet populations. As she spoke, I could see several neighbors starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats and avoid making eye contact with me. The way Karen presented the information made it sound like I was some kind of neighborhood menace who was single-handedly destroying property values through willful negligence and disregard for community welfare. When she finished her presentation, the room was uncomfortably quiet, and I could feel the weight of judgment settling over the small crowd like a heavy blanket. It was clear that Karen had succeeded in making me appear to be the problem, rather than acknowledging that she was the one who had been harassing a law-abiding homeowner for having the audacity to plant flowers in his own yard. But the fifth and most disturbing revelation came completely by accident on a Thursday afternoon, when I was working in my garage with the door open, trying to organize some boxes and enjoy the fresh air. Karen was walking past my house, talking on her phone, and apparently didn't realize how well sound carries in our quiet neighborhood. Her voice was louder than she probably intended, and her words were crystal clear as she paced back and forth on the sidewalk just outside my property line. "That's right," she was saying to whoever was on the other end of the call. "I have master keys for every house in this development. It's part of my presidential authority for handling emergency situations and conducting necessary inspections." I stopped what I was doing and listened more carefully, hardly believing what I was hearing. Karen continued her conversation, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a more confidential tone, but I could still hear every word. "Morrison won't be able to resist much longer. Nobody can keep fighting when they realize how much authority I actually have. These people need to understand that maintaining community standards requires decisive action, not endless debate and discussion." That phone conversation changed everything for me, because it revealed that Karen wasn't just an overzealous HOA president with a power complex. She was someone who believed she had the right to access my home whenever she decided it was necessary. The casual way she talked about having master keys to every house in the neighborhood made my blood run cold, because it meant this wasn't just about sunflowers or yard maintenance. It was about control, an invasion of privacy on a level I'd never imagined possible. As I stood there in my garage, listening to Karen plan what sounded like the next phase of her campaign against me, I realized that this situation had escalated far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. I was dealing with someone who genuinely believed she had the right to enter my home, monitor my activities, and make my life miserable until I submitted to her vision of how I should live. That's when I decided it was time to call my son Jake. When Jake came to visit that weekend, I could tell something was different about him from the moment he walked through my front door. Usually, our weekend visits were relaxed affairs, filled with baseball games on television, grilling burgers in the backyard, and catching up on each other's lives in the easy, comfortable way that fathers and sons do when they genuinely enjoy each other's company. But this time, when I started telling him about everything that had been happening with Karen, the escalating harassment, the mysterious master keys, and the constant surveillance, Jake's entire demeanor shifted into something I'd never seen before. Instead of offering the usual sympathetic nods and supportive comments I expected, he was taking actual notes on a small pad he'd pulled from his jacket pocket, asking pointed, specific questions, and analyzing every detail of the situation with the kind of methodical precision that reminded me of a detective working on a criminal investigation. "Dad," Jake said slowly, setting down his coffee cup and looking at me with an intensity that was almost unsettling, "this isn't just harassment anymore. What you're describing sounds like she's violating multiple state and federal laws. Does she actually have any legal authority to possess master keys to private residences in a homeowner association?" The way he phrased the question, with that careful legal language and professional tone, made me realize that I'd never actually researched the legal foundation of Karen's claimed authorities. I just assumed that HOA presidents had certain powers that I didn't understand, but Jake was suggesting that maybe those powers didn't actually exist. "Let's find out," Jake said, opening my laptop computer and pulling his chair closer to mine. "We need to look at your HOA charter documents, the state regulations governing homeowner associations, and the specific bylaws that were filed with the county when this community was established." For the next 3 hours, we dove deep into legal documents I'd never bothered to examine closely. Jake seemed to know exactly what to look for, guiding our research with questions about corporate structure, fiduciary responsibility, and property rights that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the law that surprised me. What we discovered was absolutely shocking. First, there was no provision anywhere in our HOA charter that granted the president or any officer the right to possess or maintain master keys to individual homes. That kind of authority was typically reserved for apartment complexes or rental properties where the owner retained certain access rights, not private residences in a homeowner association where each family owned their property outright. Second, when Jake helped me navigate the county's online database to track down the financial records that were supposed to be publicly available for all HOA operations, we found that Karen had authorized a $3,000 expenditure from the community budget for something called security key duplication services, without any approval from the board of directors, and without any notification to the membership. "Dad, this is embezzlement," Jake explained, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from him before, professional and serious, in a way that made me realize there were aspects of my son's life and knowledge that I'd never fully understood. "She's misappropriated community funds for unauthorized purposes, and if she's been entering people's homes without permission, even if she has keys, that's breaking and entering. Having a key doesn't give you legal authority to enter someone's private residence without their consent." As Jake was explaining the legal implications of what Karen had been doing, my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera I'd installed the previous week, partly due to Karen's increasingly aggressive behavior, and saw her standing at my front door with her usual notebook and that telltale keyring hanging prominently from her belt like some kind of badge of authority. Jake looked at the camera feed, then looked at me with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, but conveyed a sense of anticipation that made me realize he'd been thinking about this possibility. "Dad," he said quietly, "do you want to catch her in the act? Because I think we can set up a situation where she'll reveal exactly what she's been doing, and we'll have documented proof of her illegal activities." The plan we came up with was elegant in its simplicity. I would leave the house in a very obvious way, making sure Karen could see me driving away in my car, while Jake would hide in the garage and monitor everything through the security camera system. If Karen was really planning to use those master keys to enter my home, this would give her the perfect opportunity, and we'd have everything recorded as evidence. Within 20 minutes of my departure, sure enough, Karen appeared on the camera feed, exactly as we'd predicted. She approached my house cautiously at first, looking around carefully to make sure none of the neighbors were watching, but then her movements became more confident and purposeful as she reached my front door. The cameras captured everything in crystal clear, high-definition detail. Karen pulling out her keyring and examining the various keys, trying the first one and finding it didn't fit, trying the second and third keys with growing frustration, muttering to herself as each attempt failed, and finally finding the right key that turned smoothly in my lock with a satisfying click that the camera's audio picked up clearly. What happened next was even more revealing than we'd hoped. Instead of just unlocking the door and leaving, Karen actually smiled with genuine satisfaction as the lock turned, pushed the door open, and stepped inside my home like she had every right to be there. She looked around my living room with the expression of someone conducting an inspection, pulling out her notebook and actually taking notes about what she saw. That's when Jake stepped out of the garage and approached the open front door. "Excuse me," he said in a calm, authoritative voice that carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Can you tell me what you're doing in my father's house?" Karen spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance, and for just a moment I could see pure panic flash across her face before she quickly composed herself and shifted into her usual commanding persona. The transformation was remarkable to watch, like seeing someone put on a mask in real time. "Oh, you must be David's son," she said, straightening her shoulders and adopting the same tone she'd used with me during our previous confrontations. "I'm Karen Sullivan, president of the Maple Grove HOA. We received reports of a possible gas leak in this area, and I'm conducting mandatory safety inspections to protect the community." Jake nodded slowly, maintaining that calm, professional demeanor while pulling out his wallet with deliberate, measured movements. "I see. That's very responsible of you. And do you have an inspection warrant or emergency authorization from the gas company for this safety check?" Karen's confident expression began to waver slightly, but she doubled down on her authority claim. "I don't need a warrant," she said, her voice rising just enough to betray her growing nervousness. "I'm the HOA president. This kind of emergency inspection is part of my official authority to protect community safety and property values." "Actually," Jake said, flipping open his wallet to reveal a police badge that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, "you do need proper authorization for this kind of activity. I am Officer Jake Morrison with the City Police Department, and what you just did constitutes unlawful entry into a private residence, regardless of how you obtained access." The look on Karen's face at that moment was something I'll never forget. even though I was watching it happen through a security camera from 2 blocks away, where I'd parked to wait for Jake's text message. It was like watching someone's entire world collapse in the span of about 3 seconds, as all her assumptions about power and authority and her ability to intimidate people into submission suddenly crumbled in the face of actual legal consequences. Word about our HOA president being caught red-handed breaking into a resident's home spread through the Maple Grove neighborhood faster than a wildfire in dry grass during August. Within 24 hours of Jake's confrontation with Karen, the HOA's email system was completely flooded with demands for an emergency meeting. And neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in years were suddenly gathering in small groups on sidewalks and in driveways, sharing their own stories about Karen's behavior and comparing notes about similar experiences they'd all been too intimidated to discuss before. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center, and the turnout was absolutely unprecedented in the history of our neighborhood association. Nearly 200 residents packed into a space that was designed to accommodate maybe half that number, with people standing along the walls, sitting on folding chairs they'd brought from home, and even spilling out into the hallway, where they strained to hear what was happening inside. The energy in the room was absolutely electric, a mixture of anger, curiosity, anticipation, and something that felt almost like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm breaks. You could practically taste the tension in the air, as people who had been living under Karen's regime of constant surveillance and petty harassment finally had the opportunity to speak openly about their experiences without fear of retaliation. Jake attended the meeting in his capacity as both my son and as a police officer who had witnessed criminal activity firsthand. He wore his dress uniform, which seemed to command instant respect from everyone in the room, and added an official gravity to the proceedings that made it clear this wasn't just another routine neighborhood dispute. Karen arrived wearing a dark business suit instead of her usual casual attire, clearly attempting to project maximum authority and control in what she probably recognized was going to be the fight of her political life. But there was something different about her demeanor that everyone in the room could sense immediately. The usual arrogant confidence that had characterized her interactions with homeowners had been replaced by something more defensive, more calculating, like someone who knew they were in serious trouble but was still hoping they could talk their way out of it. She called the meeting to order using her usual authoritative tone and immediately went on the offensive, clearly hoping to control the narrative before anyone else could speak. It seems there's been some misunderstanding about my performance of routine safety inspections, she began, her voice steady but lacking the commanding presence that had intimidated so many residents in the past. As your duly elected president, I have certain responsibilities to ensure the security and well-being of our community, and sometimes that requires taking actions that not everyone immediately understands or appreciates. I stood up from my seat in the 3rd row, holding my tablet computer and feeling the weight of nearly 200 pairs of eyes turning toward me. "There's no misunderstanding here, Karen," I said loudly enough for everyone in the packed room to hear clearly. "Let me show everyone exactly what happened so they can judge for themselves whether this was a routine safety inspection or something else entirely." The room fell completely silent as I connected my tablet to the community center's projection system and queued up the security footage of Karen systematically trying different keys at my front door until she found one that worked, then entering my home without permission, while looking around with obvious satisfaction at her successful break-in. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Voices erupted throughout the room with comments like, "This is absolutely outrageous," and "How dare she violate our privacy like that," and "What else has she been doing when we're not home?" Several people jumped to their feet demanding answers, while others sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what they'd just witnessed, and probably wondering whether Karen had been in their homes too. Jake stepped forward to address the crowd, and his presence in uniform seemed to command instant attention from everyone in the room, including Karen, who looked like she was beginning to realize that this situation was far more serious than she'd anticipated. "As a law enforcement officer, I need to clarify the legal issues we're dealing with here," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of his profession and cutting through the angry murmur of the crowd like a knife. He pulled out a thick folder filled with papers and documents and continued, "First, I've thoroughly reviewed your HOA charter, your bylaws, and the relevant state regulations, and there is absolutely no provision anywhere in these documents that grants the president or any officer the authority to possess master keys to private residences. I want to be very clear about this. This authority simply does not exist under the law. The crowd erupted again, this time with even more anger and disbelief, as people began to understand that Karen's claimed authority had been completely fabricated. Jake held up his hand for quiet and continued his presentation. Second, we've discovered through our investigation that Mrs. Sullivan used $3,000 from the HOA budget to have unauthorized duplicate keys made, without board approval and without notifying the membership as required by your financial procedures. This constitutes embezzlement of community funds. Karen shot to her feet like she'd been launched from a catapult, her face flushed red with what looked like a combination of anger and panic. I did that to protect this community, she shouted over the growing noise of angry voices. There are homes in this neighborhood that aren't being maintained properly, and someone needs to ensure our property values don't suffer because of negligent homeowners who don't understand their responsibilities. Protect the community by violating our constitutional right to privacy? This came from Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor who had warned me about Karen's tactics weeks earlier. Her voice was shaking with emotion, but her words carried clearly across the room. Karen, do you have a key to my house too? Have you been in my home when I wasn't there? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly the room was filled with similar demands from dozens of voices. Do you have my key? Have you been in my house? What else have you been doing without our knowledge? How long has this been going on? Jake held up his hand again for quiet and continued his devastating presentation. Through our investigation, we've determined that Mrs. Sullivan has unauthorized duplicate keys for 47 homes in this neighborhood. He connected his own laptop to the projector and displayed a comprehensive list of addresses that filled the entire screen. The angry murmurs turned into outright shouts of outrage as people recognized their own addresses on the list, and several residents started demanding to know whether Karen had actually used those keys to enter their homes. The sense of violation and betrayal in the room was palpable as people realized that someone they trusted with community leadership had been systematically violating their privacy and property rights. Board member Tom Williams, who had been notably quiet during most of Karen's presidency and had seemed to go along with her increasingly authoritarian policies, finally stood up and found his voice. Karen, this is completely unacceptable and probably illegal. How do you justify violating the privacy and property rights of nearly half our neighborhood? For the first time since I'd known her, Karen looked genuinely rattled, like someone who had suddenly realized that all her carefully constructed justifications were crumbling around her. Her usual quick responses and authoritative deflections seemed to abandon her completely. I was protecting property values, she repeated, but her voice lacked any conviction and sounded more like someone desperately grasping for any argument that might save her. Someone has to maintain standards around here. Someone has to make sure people are following the rules and not letting the neighborhood deteriorate. Jake stepped closer to the podium, and his next words carried the full weight of legal authority, backed by actual knowledge of the law. Mrs. Sullivan, what you've done isn't property management or community protection. It's criminal trespassing, fraud, and embezzlement. You lied to the key duplication company, claiming to be a property manager to obtain unauthorized copies. You used community funds without proper authorization, and you've been entering private homes without permission, which is illegal, regardless of whether you have keys. The room fell completely silent as the full scope of Karen's violations sank in, and I could see people looking at each other with expressions that ranged from shock to anger to something that looked almost like relief that someone was finally holding her accountable for her actions. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone started clapping, slowly and deliberately. Others joined in, and within seconds the entire community center was filled with thunderous applause, directed not at Karen, but at Jake for finally exposing the truth and standing up to someone who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months. The formal vote to remove Karen from all HOA positions was swift and decisive. 187 votes in favor of removal, 3 opposed, and 8 abstentions. When the results were announced, Karen gathered her papers with visibly shaking hands, stood up without making eye contact with anyone in the room, and left the building without another word, her reign of neighborhood terror finally and definitively at an end. In the month following that historic HOA meeting that everyone in Maple Grove would remember for years to come, life in our neighborhood transformed in ways that I never could have imagined when I first planted those innocent sunflowers in my front yard. The change wasn't just about getting rid of Karen, it was about rediscovering what it meant to be a real community, where people looked out for each other instead of constantly watching for violations and infractions. Karen Sullivan moved out of the neighborhood during the third week after the meeting, and the speed of her departure suggested that she understood exactly how untenable her situation had become. According to the real estate gossip network that operates in every neighborhood, she was reportedly relocating to stay with family in another state, where, hopefully, she wouldn't have the opportunity to terrorize another community. Her house sold within 10 days of being listed, probably to buyers who had no idea about the drama and legal troubles that had preceded their purchase. The community elected me as interim HOA president by an overwhelming margin of 195 votes out of 200 cast, which was both humbling and terrifying considering that I'd never wanted to be involved in neighborhood politics. My first official act was to establish what we called the Maple Grove Transparency Committee, with Jake serving as our unpaid legal advisor to ensure that we never again operated outside the bounds of the law or violated anyone's rights in the name of community standards. The changes we implemented began immediately and were both practical and deeply symbolic of our commitment to doing things differently. We changed all the locks on community buildings like the center and the gym, ensuring that only properly authorized individuals had access, and that we maintained proper records of who had keys for what purposes. We installed a new security camera system, but this time with the full consent and input of all residents, designed to protect the community from outside threats rather than spy on homeowners and document minor violations. Most importantly, we completely rewrote the HOA bylaws with input from every household in the neighborhood, through a series of town halls and online surveys. The process took 3 months, but the result was a document that actually reflected the values and priorities of the people who lived here, rather than the power fantasies of an authoritarian president. The new regulations included a provision that would become known informally as the Karen Clause. No HOA officer or board member may possess, request, or maintain keys to individual private residences without written consent from the homeowner and documented legal justification approved by the full board and ratified by a majority vote of the membership. We also implemented mandatory financial transparency, requiring all expenditures over $100 to be approved by at least 3 board members and reported to the community within 48 hours. Jake began visiting more frequently, not just as my son, but as a valuable community resource who helped all of us understand our rights and responsibilities. He organized free workshops on property rights and community law that drew neighbors from surrounding developments who wanted to understand their own legal protections better. These sessions became so popular that we had to move them from my living room to the community center to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. Mrs. Peterson was elected as our new vice president and treasurer, bringing decades of neighborhood knowledge and a commitment to fiscal responsibility that put Karen's secretive spending and financial manipulation to shame. Every financial transaction is now posted on our community website within 24 hours, and any expenditure over $500 requires a community vote, with at least 7 days' notice to allow for discussion and input. The atmosphere of fear, surveillance, and constant anxiety that had characterized Karen's presidency was replaced by genuine collaboration, mutual respect, and the kind of neighborly cooperation that makes living in a community actually enjoyable. People started talking to each other again instead of hurrying past with their heads down, worried about attracting unwanted attention from the HOA patrol. The most visible and symbolic representation of our transformation was the community garden we created on the vacant lot where Karen had once planned to install additional surveillance equipment and create what she called a compliance monitoring station. Instead of more tools for watching and controlling residents, we established a beautiful shared space where each family could grow whatever brought them joy, without restrictions on plant heights, flower colors, or any of the arbitrary aesthetic rules that had made people afraid to express themselves. My sunflowers became the centerpiece of this garden, their bright yellow faces serving as a daily reminder that beauty and freedom can flourish when people are allowed to live their lives without fear of constant judgment and harassment. Children play freely in the common areas now. Elderly neighbours sit on new benches sharing stories and watching the world go by, and the sound of genuine laughter has replaced the hush whispers of people afraid of being cited for imaginary violence. Every morning now, I sit on my front porch with my coffee and watch neighbours walk their dogs. Families work together in the garden, and kids ride their bikes down streets where they don't have to worry about someone measuring the exact distance between their handlebars and the curb. It's the kind of neighbourhood I thought I was moving to when I first came to Maple Grove, and it took Karen's abuse of power to help us all realise what we wanted our community to actually be. Jake often jokes with me about how Karen accidentally created the most positive change our neighbourhood had seen in years. "Dad," he'll say, while we're working in the garden together, "who would have thought that one person's abuse of power would end up teaching an entire community how to stand up for themselves and create something better?" It's true in a way that neither of us could have predicted. Karen's overreach had become so extreme and her violations so obvious that it forced all of us to educate ourselves about our rights and responsibilities, creating a stronger, more informed, and more unified community than we'd ever been before. Sometimes the worst neighbours inadvertently become the catalysts for bringing out the best in everyone else. The final chapter of the Karen saga came 6 weeks after the meeting, when we received official notification that all criminal charges had been dropped in exchange for her full cooperation in returning all the stolen keys and reimbursing the embezzled funds with interest. She had also agreed to never seek any position in a homeowner association again, anywhere in the state, which seemed like a reasonable way to protect other communities from experiencing what we'd been through. Justice had been served, not through revenge or retaliation, but through the simple act of people standing together and demanding accountability from someone who had forgotten that leadership means serving the community, not controlling it. As I finish telling this story, I'm looking out at those same sunflowers that started this whole incredible ordeal, now surrounded by a thriving garden that represents everything Karen's version of community standards was not. They're tall, bright, beautiful, and completely free to grow as high as nature intended them to reach, just like the people in our neighbourhood who learned that they don't have to accept abuse from anyone, no matter what title or authority they claim to possess. Sometimes the most important battles for freedom and dignity are fought not with weapons or harsh words, but with the simple insistence that every person deserves respect, privacy, and the fundamental right to live peacefully in their own home. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up to a bully to discover that they're not standing alone after all, and that a community united in defense of what's right can overcome any abuse of power.